and welcome back to the How to Podcast series. It's Dave with you, episode 384 on the How to Podcast series. I'm glad to have you here, and thank you for pressing play, and thank you for giving me some of your time, your precious, beautiful time. You and I together, talking podcasting, and I hope at the end of this episode that you have some real, tangible things you can do in your next episode as you record. And I want to encourage you to keep moving forward with your podcast. You got this. Doing great. And I would love to hear your show, by the way. If you and I haven't met yet, virtually, email-wise, SpeakPipe-wise, whatever, you and I haven't talked yet. We haven't actually spoken to each other in person. I want to listen to your podcast. I'm always looking for the next podcast to fall in love with. And I promise you, I'm going to listen to your show. I really am. There's some gurus out there in this space, which I don't understand this at all. Side tangent. They will coach you on your podcast without having ever listened to your show. Like, I don't know how you coach people about improving a podcast when you never even listen to it. And it sounds like they have no concept of what the show's even about. They're like, can you explain to me what your podcast is about? Because I don't know what you do. You'll never get that with me. I listen to your show because I want you to get the listen. I want that to show up on your stats. That's important. But B, I also want to know you. I want to know you before we work together, before we do any coaching together, before you jump into my meetups. I just want you to know that there's someone that actually cares enough about you as a podcaster to actually listen to your show. So if you're looking for somebody who coaches podcasters, who has a community, who has time in my calendar for you and I to get together one-on-one, just you and I, and you want somebody who actually listens to your show and comes with knowledge and recommendations on maybe how we can make things better or how we can fix problems that you're experiencing, I want to do that for you. So howtopodcast.ca is where you can find me, and I'd love to do that for you. I heard this thing recently kind of unpacked for me, completely unrelated to podcasting, but I'm like, just if you know me, I'm going to bring it into podcasting. And the idea simply was, and I have my little piece of cardboard beside me because I write it down at work. It was, don't give a lesson without a story, and don't give a story without a lesson. Don't share a lesson without a story, and don't share a story without a lesson. Are you still with me? Okay, because we're going to get into this a little bit more and talk about why lessons and stories are so intermingled in your podcast and why you need both. It's kind of like, having the left side of your body and the right side of your body. They complement each other. They are the opposite in some cases, but without them, there's only half of you. And I think in podcasting, sometimes we lean heavily on lessons, teaching lessons, and we're devoid of any stories to supplement the lessons, or we're all about the story, and at the end of the podcast, we're like, what was that about? There's nothing I can apply to my life from that story. Great story, but what am I going to do with it? So I think we need to have both. So those old-time scales, they'd have weights on one side, weight on the other, and, it kind of like balances, right? Or a teeter-totter when you were a kid, that long piece of wood, and you sat on one end and somebody sat on the other end, and if they're heavier than you, your feet never touch the ground. Those things, right? We need some balance in our podcast between lessons and stories. And we're going to unpack that together here in the show. So I'm glad you're here. And if you've ever struggled in this, then maybe this is the right episode for you to help you. And if you know anybody else that's struggling with lessons and stories in their podcast, how to do better lessons and how to tell better stories, please share this episode with them. I'd love for them to hear this as well. So thanks for listening. Here we go. So in podcasting, we have podcasts that I would say kind of fall into two main buckets. A third one if you combine the two. So let's focus on the two. We have podcasts that are they're basically lessons that have no stories. Okay? So lessons with no stories. A lesson without a story can be delivered through informative content. They can focus on conveying information directly, but it's a lesson. Okay? Think of math class. Think of science. Think of history. where it's just a lesson. You're just given the information, we're done. No stories, a lesson without stories. That's one bucket. Another one is stories that have no lessons. So they can simply be just an entertainment podcast, and the whole idea is to tell you a story and we're done. Great. So we have lessons with no stories, and we have stories with no lessons. But then the third one is stories and lessons equally combined. So as you're listening to a story, you're learning something at the same time. And as you listen to the lesson, you're being taught through story. So I like the idea of blending the two. Now, do I do it every time in every episode? No. But it's something that we can consider for our next episode. Do we kind of lean towards lessons and no stories? Do we lean towards stories with no lessons? Or do we do both? Ask yourself. Look back at your past episodes. More lessons? More stories? Or a combo of both? How is your podcast set up? I'd like to hear. Let me know. Howtopodcast.ca. Use a SpeakPipe. Tell me. So I want to encourage you to have this interplay between lessons and stories in your podcast. The most effective podcasts, in my humble opinion, often combine both lessons and stories to create an engaging and more educational content for your audience. So here's how this interplayment works, how it all kind of works together. 4 things. First is engagement. For me, stories make lessons more engaging and more memorable. By embedding educational content within a story, podcasts can capture listeners' attention and retain it more effectively. Do you want me to read off a whole bunch of stuff to you right now and it be dry and devoid of story and just like you kind of nod off and you're like, oh, I missed 5 minutes of that. I don't even know what he said. That's what I'm talking about podcasting. There seems to be some shows that are so hyper-focused on the lessons, they forget the story part. So I'm encouraging you to think about how you can make your show better. And there's people who have such great stories, but again, it's kind of like candy at the end of it, fun in the moment, but doesn't really fill you up. It doesn't really satisfy you, and it's just kind of a, okay, well, what was that? What just happened, right? So lessons and stories, I love them. By combining them together, you get better engagement. What else? Emotional connection. Stories have the power to create a really, truly amazing emotional connection with your audience, making these lessons more relatable and impactful. People will remember a story. People will remember that terrible dad joke, right? Some come to mind as soon as I say dad joke. They're right there. People will remember a story. This connection emphasizes the learning experience and encourages listeners to reflect on the information presented in a story. Another great thing about combining lessons and stories together is creating context. Stories really help provide context for the lesson. It helps us to put ourselves into the lesson instead of just listening to a lesson. It helps us to absorb it even more because we place ourselves in the situation. We place ourselves in that location, that time, that event. And it helps listeners to understand the relevance of the application of the information to ourselves because we're in the moment, in the story. Context makes your content more accessible and more applicable in real life situations. I can see myself in that story and I would react this way. I would feel this way. I feel like I would laugh. I would cry. I would be in that moment with you because you help me with context. Context helps content. They go together, hand in hand. And then the last part under this around why lessons and stories should be combined together as one package goes to retention. One thing podcasters really want in their show is retention. What does that simply mean? People come to your podcast, they press play, and they listen to the whole thing all the way to the end. Why? We want people to listen to our show. We've put a lot of work into this. Yes, we get credit for a few seconds at the beginning of the podcast, maybe a minute of listens, counts as a listen to our show. But if we have a 45-minute podcast and people only listen to 1 minute of it, what happens to the 44 minutes of unlistened content? Is that a great experience for the listener? Is that a great experience for the host who put all this time and effort into their show and everybody bounces after the first minute? Congratulations, you got a download, you got a stat. Somebody listened to your 1 minute of your 45-minute podcast, but they didn't hear anything that you talked about after the intro. Is that why you podcast? To get that number? Is that why you're doing this? I want people to listen to the entire podcast. And I always encourage people to recommend to their audience to please listen to the entire episode. It's a great signal to all the apps, whatever it is, because every app wants you to stay on the app. So if you come to the show, you press play, and you stay to the end, the apps are going to take notice of it. I don't know how it all works behind the scenes because I don't work there. I just know that it makes sense that anybody that comes to an app and stays on the app is preferred over somebody who comes to the app and leaves 60 seconds after pressing play. It just makes sense. Correct? So we want better retention. We want our lessons to be presented through stories. They are more likely to be remembered. The narrative structure helps listeners recall key points and insights more effectively than dry, factual presentations. People retell stories. People retell lessons structured as a story. Stories are easy to share. Lessons are a little more difficult because you have to remember all of it. I love packaging a lesson and a story together. It becomes highly shareable and highly memorable as well. So for podcasting specifically, as we talk about the fact that your lessons need a story and your stories need a lesson, let's look at some practical thoughts for podcasting. First, we as podcasters need to plan our content better. And I can hear you already. Well, you don't know me. You don't know how I plan my content. Well, I'm just taking a wild shot in the dark here that for most of us, we don't plan our content as much as we could. We could probably do a little bit more. Before you hit record on your next episode, I want you to plan out how you are going to integrate your lessons into your stories. Consider what educational points you want to convey, and then how they can be naturally woven into a story. Personal stories are the best because I get to learn about you as the host and I get to learn about whatever we're talking about at the same time. Any type of story that you can tell from your own perspective, your lived experience, will make the content resonate better with me as a listener. So be vulnerable. Share some stories. Share some things from your past. Share some things that you're learning today, right now in the moment. It really helps people to connect with you. And then the second part of this, and I love this one. This is really great. Use mentor podcasts. What does that mean? I want you to do some homework. And I want you to go find a mentor podcast. Maybe it's this one. Maybe it's not. Go find a podcast that would mentor you. Now, do you need to talk to the host? No, you don't really have to, but you find a podcast that effectively combines lessons and stories. And then analyze how they structure their content to engage with and educate their listeners. Find a mentor podcast. So I'll give you an example. In real time, I do a lot of interviews. And one thing I love, and I'm going to say it again, and you're going to be like, oh, here he goes. Mel Robbins. Now, I have her books. I have listened to her podcasts. I listen to her audiobooks. And what I love is when she talks to me as a listener. I love it. When she's like, hey, it's your friend Mel. That makes me smile. Like, it is really, she's talking to me. And she always makes me the main focus of her podcast, even if she has a guest. I just love how she welcomes every listener, even if you're the first time being there. She talks about why this episode is good for you and who she thinks you are because you press play. Like, so focused. For me, Mel Robbins is a mentor podcast. I listen, I learn, the content's great, but I also like how she podcasts. And if you've never listened to her show, go listen to any intro from any episode, guest or solo, and you will hear her talking to you. She is a mentor podcast for me. Now, am I copying her? No. I don't come on and say, hey, it's your friend Dave. That's her thing. And she does it so well. It's so natural. It's so Mel. I'm not going to steal that. But I love how she addresses her audience. And I love that she talks to one person on her show. Talking to you. So find a mentor podcast. Who is it for you? If you don't know, then I can help you and maybe steer you in the direction that might help you to find one. I listen to a lot of podcasts. So maybe you and I can work together and find you a mentor podcast. Again, you're not going there to copy them. You're going there to be inspired by them. And there's something about them that is going to make your show better. Find a mentor podcast. The third part around practical application of lessons and stories in your podcast would be to engage your audience. I want you to encourage interaction with your audience for your show, whether you have 3 listens or 3,000 listens, by asking questions and inviting feedback. And you're like, Dave, you know how hard it is to get anybody to do anything as a listener? Yeah, I have 8 podcasts. I multiply your frustration times 8, right? I would love to have more. I keep asking you. Maybe you've never reached out and you've been here for a while. I keep asking you and I haven't heard from you yet. This whole back and forth about podcasting, it's a lot of work. It takes consistency. It takes repetition. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. It takes a lot of time before somebody will trust you enough to actually do what you're asking them to do. So I have SpeakPipe on my website. You can leave me a message anytime. I have Buy Me a Coffee. And the donations that come in, I redistribute back to other podcasters. Thank you for that. I have email. I have my website. I have social media. These are all ways to get in touch with me. There's a free calendar link that you can get to me on my website where you can jump in my calendar and you and I can jump on Zoom together and have a conversation about podcasting. And you know what? It's free. I'm not going to sell you anything. I just want to meet you. You need to come up with a way to give your audience the most easiest way possible to engage with you. Again, asking questions, asking for feedback, asking them for survey results, being in the DMs, being on social media, being where your audience is. So if you are a business podcast, you should be at the big accounting conference in your city. If you collect Beanie Babies, you should be at a collecting thing. You should be where your audience is. Engage with them. Make the effort. Get away from the mic. Talk to people. Get out there and engage with your audience. This can help reinforce the lessons that are shared on your show and make storytelling way more of a back and forth as we work together as listeners and hosts. And then the last part about applying this to your podcast is a challenge for you that you can do this week to reflect and adapt. When you're done your episode, and after each time you do a podcast episode, reflect on how effectively you conveyed the lessons through your stories. And then use feedback to adapt your approach for future episodes. You're like, Dave, I don't get feedback on my shows. I've asked my wife, I asked my husband, I asked my kids, I asked that person who sits beside me at the office. And the feedback I get, no offense to anybody that's helped me, but has not been that great. I really would like somebody who knows what podcasting is, and I don't know who to ask. Well, you're listening to one right now. I love helping people with their podcasts, and I love giving feedback. I'm not here to tell you all the things you want to hear. There's going to be some things that we bring up in our conversation. You're like, oh yeah, yeah, I kind of thought that was the thing I should work on. Yeah, I'll point those out for you. But I won't do it in a way that's snarky. I won't do it in a way that tears people down. That's not who I am. I just want to help you. And I think that we need, as much as we keep looking at the next thing in our podcast, we have to make the episode, promote the episode, research the next episode, interview the guests, send the emails, do the social media. Not very many people talk about stopping, reflecting, and adapting your show. So sometimes it's good to take a little pause, even if you have to miss a week, and just reflect, where am I at? How am I growing? Am I doing the same thing every week thinking I'm getting better, but I never change? Reflect and adapt. I think as we as podcasters show up in this world, as we integrate lessons into stories, podcasters can create content that's really both engaging and educational. I think we need both. Make the listening experience more impactful and memorable for your audience. And don't give a lesson without a story. And don't share a story without a lesson. I'm curious about what you think about this episode. Does this resonate with you? Do you see yourself in this conversation? I'd love to hear from you. howtopodcast.ca. It's always there for you all the time, 24/7. It's not Facebook. You don't need to log in to get to my website. You don't need a password. You don't have to download anything. It's right there. And I'd love to talk to you anytime. howtopodcast.ca. Thanks for listening. Come back for our next episodes because we're going to be doing a little mini-series around behind the mic. A little bit more about personal development for you as podcaster. We go way beyond technology. We go way beyond what microphone should I buy. We go way beyond all that other stuff. And we go behind the mic. And I want to help you show up better as a host, as an interviewer, as a podcaster. And I want you to spend some time focusing on you. Because it's going to come through you as you grow and change through your microphone and into the ears of your listener. And it's going to help you. I know it's going to help you. So a little mini-series coming up called Behind the Mic. Can't wait to share it with you. I'm working on it, recording it right now in the background while I'm doing this. And I'm excited for you to experience this. So stay tuned. Follow the show. Subscribe. If you're on YouTube and you're listening to this, I love you. Thank you for being here. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel so people know that, hey, these people come to YouTube and they're like, this podcast is great. I would love for you to do that as well. Follow, subscribe to the show, whatever it takes. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate you. And again, I'd love to talk to you anytime. howtopodcast.ca. Take care, guys. Thank you so much for listening to the entirety of the episode, including this part. You know what? A lot of people leave right now. So we'll let them leave. Give them a second to go. Okay, now it's just you and me. We have our meetups that we do for the How to Podcast series. We do them during the week, and we also do them on Saturdays. So twice a week, you have the opportunity to meet other podcasters, just like you. Some people have just started. Some people haven't even released an episode yet. Some have been doing it forever. And we get together and talk podcasting. We want to help you in community to continue with your show, to start your show, to grow your show. So come and meet listeners of this show in one space on meetup.com. Again, through howtopodcast.ca, you'll see the links. It's completely free to join. Come whenever you have an opportunity to come. There's no commitment. You don't have to sign any waivers. You can just come join us. Come join the conversation. We'd love to have you there because the only thing that's going to make these meetups better is you being there. So I'm hoping you will say yes. And you'll say, Dave, I'm tired of podcasting by myself. I wish there were people I could connect with that are fellow podcasters and share my frustrations with guests who ghost me and my editing software is crapping out on me and I'm just having this hard time. I'm just having a hard time coming up with podcasts, episodes and titles and all the things and social media. Wouldn't it be great to get in a room with other podcasters and share best practices and learn? 3 of our 4 Saturdays every month are themed. So you have a topic, but that last Saturday of every month is open question and answer. Ask anything. Come meet a podcaster. Come enjoy the podcasting community through howtopodcast.ca. Come to our meetups. Can't wait to see you there.